The National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center was established to develop and maintain a collaborative network to support resource development and dissemination, training and technical assistance, and workforce development for Hispanic Latino populations and communities receiving mental health services throughout the U.S. mainland and the Caribbean. We offer free technical assistance. If you want more information, please contact us. The National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC is under the direction of the Institute for Research, Education and Services in Addiction, IRESA, and housed at the Universidad Central del Caribe School of Medicine in Puerto Rico, and supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. As mentioned, the Mental Health TTC network is funded by SAMHSA. SAMHSA strives to reduce the impact of substance use and mental health disorders on U.S. communities throughout its programs and services, and demonstrates that behavioral health is essential to health. Prevention works, treatment is effective, and people recover from mental and substance use disorders. You can learn more about SAMHSA by visiting www.samhsa.gov. And now our moderator.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the National Hispanic and Latinos Mental Health TTC webinar, The Faces of Immigration, Humanizing Children, and Creating Culturally Congruent School-Based Context. Today's presenter is Dr. Miguel Gallardo. So I'm gonna let you know a little bit about Dr. Gallardo. Dr. Gallardo is a professor of psychology and director of Aliento, the Center for Latino Communities at Pepperdine University. He has published journal articles, books, and book chapters in the areas of multicultural psychology, Latino psychology, ethics and evidence-based practices, cultural humility, and racial color blindness. He is currently a series editor for Cornella Academic Press's Advances in Culture, Race, and Ethnicity book series. Dr. Gallardo is currently Director of Research and Evaluation for the Multi-Ethnic Collaborative of Community Agencies, MECA, a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving monolingual Arab, Farsi, Korean, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Spanish-speaking communities. Dr. Gallardo served as 6-year governor-appointed licensed member of the California Board of Psychology. He is currently serving a 5-year appointment on the Clergy Misconduct Oversight Board for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and he is a fellow of the American Psychological Association. So now that we know our presenter, we're going to proceed with the poll questioning to get to know our audience. And here we go. Our first question: do you currently serve Hispanic and Latino youth with any serious emotional disturbance? Yes or no? So 67% of our audience said yes and 35% no. Our next question: are you planning to serve youth, Hispanic and Latino populations from school in the next 6 months? Okay, so 61% say yes, 22% no, and 21% don't know. What is your current professional role? We have 19% social worker, case manager, 39% counselor, therapist, or psychologist or nurse, 12% faculty, research, or student, 11% government, and 21% other. What type of setting do you currently work in? And we have so 11% university or higher education institution, 18% treatment, 15% school-based, 15% government, and 38% other. So we'll now proceed to our pre-post. The first question is, schools are not legally required to open their doors to unaccompanied immigrant youth. True or false? And 79% say false, 21% say true. The zero tolerance policy in the United States is protection for innocent US citizens. True or false? And we have that 82% say false and 19% say true. And our last question, helping immigrant youth stay connected to their cultural roots helps develop resilience. True or false? And 100% of our participants say yes. Thank you everybody for participating. Now that we know a little bit more about our presenter and our audience, we're gonna proceed with the presentation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pull up my presentation now so that everyone can see that. Let me do that. I'm going to minimize this. Can you hear me okay, Dadis? Yeah? Okay. Let me just make sure everyone can hear. I believe I'm good. Okay. So
Yes,
what I wanted to,
oh,
okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the confirmation.
okay.
So I'm gonna. So first off, thanks for participating in this morning's webinar or afternoon, depending on where you're in from or wherever it might be. So I'm gonna try to just spend a little bit of time. We don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm just gonna try to introduce and talk about some important issues that I think are really, really relevant in this conversation, and I'm going to try to provide a context for sort of what's happening now in the United States and even just globally across the world, and how we can really prepare ourselves and situate ourselves to really be, I think, more responsive to the needs of children and what's happening today. I talked about, I titled this presentation as the Faces of Immigration. And you'll hear me talk about a little bit later that children are really being used as human hostages and at this moment in time. And I think that's one of my greatest concerns that we're experiencing at this moment in time. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm always aware that when I do these talks and have these types of presentations that I realize I might be speaking to the choir in some ways, and hopefully, if that's true, you'll take some new things away or think about things in a way that you haven't before. And if it's new to you, then hopefully you've gained some new information that you obviously didn't know before or weren't aware of before. So let me continue. So I start off with this particular quote by George Santayana, who said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And I think that is really poignant. And what we're seeing happening today in the United States without any question at this moment in time. I'm going to actually, let me go back actually, because I want to, before I continue, I want to read a story to you that I think really captures what I hope you take away from today's brief time together. And it's a story, it's entitled No Distinction. During the war in Sarajevo, a reporter saw a child being shot, and he rushed to the man cradling her. As the man carried her, the reporter guided them to his car and sped off to a hospital. Hurry, the man urged. My child is still alive. A moment later, he pleaded, Hurry, my child is still breathing. A little later, Please, my child is still warm. Although the reporter drove quickly, the little girl died. In sadness, the man said, I must now go tell her father that his child is dead. He will be heartbroken. The reporter stood speechless. Looking at the grieving man, he said, I thought she was your child. The man replied, No, but aren't they all our children? And so, obviously, we're not face to face, and I can't see you, you can see me. But the story, I think, captures what I hope we start to begin to understand in a different way, what's happening now, and how we're treating both just, I think, human beings in general, particularly immigrants to the United States, but also children at this moment in time, who are the most vulnerable. And I think, one of the, I always get asked this question when I talk about these particular issues, and people always ask me if I think Trump's the issue or the problem. And while I think the current administration certainly hasn't helped the situation, we're talking about masses of people who are supporting issues that are dehumanizing human adults, children, etc., in many ways. And so that's of great concern to me. And so I'm hoping that we can start to see that differently, and see our responsibility to one another. This is not the first time this has happened, not only in the United States, but certainly around the world. There are other precedents for our current, zero tolerance policy that's separating children from parents at the border, many of whom are still not reunited with their parents. Our immigration policies, the border wall, all these buzzwords and conversations. I mean, we have a history here, and that's why I started with that particular quote around, if we don't remember where we've come, we are certainly going to continue to repeat what's happening now. And so, I think here in the United States, we're most of us are familiar with what happened with our native populations here in the United States through European colonization, Christian colonization, and as a result of all that, the Native American populations, first native communities were, declined precipitously due to the introduction of illnesses and diseases that didn't exist before, war, the removal from land and territorial confiscation, and of course slavery, which has really resulted in a long generation of historical trauma. And so I think historical trauma has certainly been, I think, connected to Native communities in the United States for a long time. But I think what we're starting to see and talk about in different ways is the results of historical trauma across many communities. And I think what we're doing now in the United States is certainly creating, if not already there, the manifestations and the foundations for the initiation of the historical intergenerational trauma that will continue for years moving forward. This happened in Canada as well, the Canadian Indian residential school system, which was really promoted as the dissemination of indigenous cultures, as an altruistic civilizing program. It was really about, historian John Malloy said the aim was to kill the Indian child. Colonizers believed they were civilizing savages, and the civilizing mission rested on a belief of racial superiority. And so you could replace kill the Indian child with kill the immigrant child, or whatever other context we may find this in. That these issues are still happening today, and as a result of a lot of removal and of communities from their context, from their cultural connections, etc. We see, post-traumatic stress. We see the results of alcohol and substance use, suicides, which are continuing to happen even with unaccompanied immigrant youth today. And my concern when we see these particular issues happening and unfolding is we tend to blame the individual for what's happening. Somehow it's a fault of their own. Somehow they do not have the resources or the strategies to adapt to and to cope with and to adjust with what's happening. And so the burden falls on the individual oftentimes, whereas we fail to connect it to the larger socio-political. In Britain, Operation Pied Piper, which was the largest evacuation of children in the 1930s. By the way, before I go to this one, we also had the Japanese internment camps here in the United States, right during World War II, and so another situation and instance. There are many, and so I always run the risk of leaving something out when I start to identify particular issues, but there are many. And going back to Operation Pied Piper, 800,000 children were removed in the first 4 days. Ultimately, 2 million aged 5 and up from London and other cities were removed. And really, it was the PR campaigns during that time was really to purify the English race, children, saving children in order to glorify the Allied cause. Eugenics-based campaign was promoted to select the healthy, intelligent children of sound hereditary background and send them away elsewhere for the preservation of and purity of English race, if you will. So, again, former Border Patrol agent Cantu stated that deterrence was really, in a New York Times article, that deterrence was the underlying basis for U.S. zero tolerance. He also quoted former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who, when pressed on whether children were being separated from parents to deter crossovers, said, yes, hopefully people will get the message. Human hostages. Devin has talked about this as as children as pawns, if you will. Like the proposed border wall, the rationale, the patriotic rationale for Trump's anti-migrant immigration policies has been purported as protecting citizens, innocent citizens, from bad guys, border bad guys, rapists, murderers, smugglers. But without taking children's lives into account, and that's what's happening, Hal. I think the administration has reinforced this notion that the separating of children was protection against drug smugglers, child trafficking, even though the State Department has said that separating children can have long-lasting psychological damage that leaves actually these kids more vulnerable to trafficking and other hazards, and that we know this. Again, I'm probably speaking to the choir in many ways, but we know that these residential institutions, detention centers, etc., cannot meet the needs of these children who are removed from family members. And in fact, we know that where children are being housed today is further traumatizing in many ways. The exception is where they're treated with dignity and respect. The norm is where that is not happening due to simply, poor resources, poor prioritizing of dedicating resources to take care of them, etc. And so, I would say that, simultaneously, and others have talked about this as well, that while all this is happening, we are seeing a resurgence of white supremacist ideology groups, the manifestation of more overt acts of racism and discord between communities, both white communities, communities of color, etc. And so this is a repeat. We're certainly repeating what we have seen before, and I think with every revision of dehumanizing populations and communities, the stakes get higher and the situations increase. And so Bonilla Silva would call these types of things happening today as this new racism. I'm just going to briefly talk about this, because I think it's important to frame the context that, he talks about this idea that, and again, I think what we're seeing a little bit of the both and, the policies that are being, put forth are under the guise of protection from bad people, protecting the children from bad things happening to them, protecting U.S. citizens from bad things infiltrating our country, etc. And Bonilla Silva would say the racial prejudice and racial language of the past, are no longer the primary ideological tools used to defend the status quo. And so this zero tolerance policy, at least from my perspective, and I would assume from his and others, is that this is a good example of, of what some would even argue may even be like non-racial, if you will, because of how it's described, how it's talked about, etc. And so he says racism is subtle, institutionalized, and again non-racial. And so I think that's a good example of what we're seeing today. And for anybody, and I saw the poll that at the beginning, and so for anyone who is working directly with these children or working directly with people who are being impacted in some way, either very directly or indirectly through the immigration process and our immigration policies at this moment in time, it is important to know that none of us are off the hook. So implicit bias is this notion that it's a bias in judgment and or behavior that really is a manifestation of subtle cognitive processes that we have, that all of us have, that operate at a level below conscious awareness and without intentional control. And so, it does not matter what color your skin is, what your surname may be, where you're from, where you were born, etc. We carry biases. We carry prejudicial perspectives. We carry ideas about how we see things and how we are as influenced by what we are not told as much as by what we are. And so if you're working with these children in school-based settings or in other types of settings and their families, it behooves us to really analyze and take a sort of a reflection of where what our attitudes and what biases we may hold. And I think one of the biases that sometimes comes up when we're talking about immigrants and immigration and just folks of color in general is we tend to, I think, in some ways think about what's not okay, what's not right. And I think this is true for most of us who've been trained within a mental health disciplines, if you will, of some point, whether it's social work, marriage and family therapy, psychology, whatever it is. I think we tend to look for what's not okay with people, what's wrong with people, and so I'm gonna really argue that we start to find out what's right with people first, what's good about people first, what resources they have, and so I think we even examining our own biases helps us begin to shift a little bit around how we may see people, what we may see as their capacities to survive, to thrive, their resources, etc. And there's been a lot of neuroscience research. I'm not going to go into that just for the sake of time, but there's been a lot of neuroscience research that's looked at parts of the brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the medial prefrontal cortex. It really is where we code and respond to when we see things as highly human. It activates. It fails to activate when we dehumanize people. The amygdala is our integrative center for emotions, emotional behavior, and motivation. There's been research studies that have included a diverse group of individuals that when they're shown images of homeless people or drug users, whatever it may be, that their brains are scanned while these studies are happening. That their brains are not activating when they're looking at homeless people or drug users and or people of color. The amygdala becomes activated. The medial prefrontal cortex does not become activated, thereby indicating that even people who purport not to have biases or not to have racial preconceived notions, or etc., are maybe unaware of some of those things. So there's information that we may be unaware of, and so I think it behooves us to understand what that looks like for us, so that we're situated in a place to serve these children and their families in the best way possible. So the psychological effects of immigration and what's happening now. Just to give some definitions taken from the English Language Learner and Multilingual Achievement Office. A newcomer is a student who's been in the U.S. less than 3 years and speaks a language other than English at home. We have unaccompanied minors or unaccompanied immigrant youth who've crossed the border without documents and without a parent, apprehended and then released. When released, they have court dates set, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. Children of migrant families who are apprehended at the border with an adult family member. Oftentimes when they're apprehended, those children are grouped with the unaccompanied immigrant youth because they receive the same services and go through similar legal proceedings. And then we have refugee and asylee, which are individuals, families, children who were forced to flee their homes, home countries because of war, violence, natural disasters, etc. Okay, so just to give a background of that. Again, remembering our past, I have here help wanted, no Irish need apply. At some point in time, the Irish and the Italian were those individuals who were, on the receiving end of discrimination, racist policies, institutional racism, etc. Today, it's a different set of immigrant communities, if you will. And so, we know that people are leaving their countries of origin because of extreme circumstances. There are abuses happening. There's high homicide rates that are happening. There's victimization of women and children that happen. Human trafficking. Discrimination and crimes against LGBTQAI plus communities. So there are human rights violations happening across the world, and people are trying to find relief from those circumstances. And so when they're attempting to find relief from those circumstances and coming to a place where they're hoping to find relief, but then further traumatized, the impact it has is undeniable in many ways. I talk to and work with immigrant families all the time, and so these are good folks who are in many ways trying to develop better lives for their families, and yet we clump them in our national dialogue as people who are not good people, not okay people who are coming to take advantage of our system and our circumstances and opportunities, etc. And so we know that there are high rates of PTSD, anxiety, depression, psychosomatic complaints, suicidal ideation, and completion that we're hearing about and seeing quite a bit about. And then complex trauma. I still think this notion of complex trauma, and I'll talk about our definition and idea about trauma in just a few minutes. But complex trauma is how we really should be thinking about understanding what's happening to these children and their families. And we know in looking at the literature of complex trauma and reactions to complex trauma, that is the manifestation of traumatic events and circumstances over the course of one's life, beginning in at early childhood and through the course of their life, has can have impacts around, relational parent-child relational concerns at times, emotional and behavioral challenges, maybe impact self-image and self-esteem, and then also impact, I think, physical and cognitive development as well. And so, it's fair to say and safe to say that what's happening to the children at this moment in time could have developmental impacts on their processes, those things that most of us take for granted in the development of children might be impacted because of the trauma and what they're experiencing. I mentioned this concept of children as human hostages. So there's been research that has been done, obviously, in these particular communities, and there was some research done by Rojas Flores and colleagues, and they looked at the multiple informants in their research study: parents, teachers, clinicians, the child themselves, etc. And they indicated that citizen children of detained and deported parents experience more psychological distress and trauma compared to peers whose parents have had no involvement with the immigration enforcement. And to some of us that may be like the obvious in many ways, but I have this here because I think we also the impact, the traumatic impact and emotional distress that our immigration policies have transcend, I think, both obviously unaccompanied immigrant youth, children coming with a parent or parents or family member, and those children of immigrant family and parents who were born here in the United States. Obviously, the children who were brought over at an early age and fall under DACA, another group. So the traumatic experience is across multiple domains with regards to people who have some connection to or are impacted by this immigration process. They also found in this research study that there were higher levels of parent-reported PTSD symptoms in children of detained and deported parents. Obviously, again, suggesting that forced parental separation is detrimental to children's mental health. There's evidence, other studies have found that there's evidence that suggests that arrest and imprisonment of parents disrupts the relationship, alters family support networks, and obviously impacts mental health. And also in the study that Rojas and Flores did with her colleagues, that they found that children with more exposure to traumatic life events were also rated by parents and teachers as having more externalizing problems. And by clinicians as having more total dysfunction. And so I'm using terms that were utilized in the research studies and to preserve the integrity of these authors and researchers' work. But I'm saying this because I think it's important to know that we have to contextualize what we're seeing. So externalizing problems or more dysfunction, I think we have to contextualize what that looks like for students, so that we're not placing the burden and pathologizing these kids in ways that are unfair and unjust for them. And in fact, they also found that children with traumatic related symptoms were at risk of being misdiagnosed, overdiagnosed, misdiagnosed with things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, conduct difficulties, particularly when not looking at complex trauma and assessing for complex trauma. So I think it becomes really easy for us to identify and diagnose and in many ways pathologize what we're seeing. But I think we have to, again, how would we want our own children to be responded to? How would we want I'm a father, and how would I want someone to respond to my kids? How would you want someone to respond to your own kids in many ways? And situating ourselves in that particular space and locality, so that when we are encountering these situations, we are humanizing and affirming the humanity of these children and their families. They also found that children exposed to potentially traumatic events scored higher in internalizing concerns, negative moods and emotions, compared with children of permanent residents or parents with no contact with immigration and custom enforcement. So the overlap of depression and anxiety symptoms was significantly higher among children with PTSD symptomology. Unaccompanied minors, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. The numbers I have here, actually, I was looking at some data again, yeah, even as recently as a couple of days ago, and I had already sent this in though, so I didn't change it. But those numbers are higher. I think we've seen over 120,000, close to 150,000 children who've come over as unaccompanied minors. That number is continuing to increase. We know that many of them are originating from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and so these numbers are increasing. And again, I want to point out, the bullet point, the last two bullet points there, the psychosocial stressors. So there's different levels at which stressors occur. Pre-migration, reasons why they may be leaving their countries of origin. While en route, in transit, whatever circumstances they encounter when they get here, that temporary resettlement, and then permanent resettlement. So if they're fortunate enough to be able to find a space here permanently in the United States, there's a huge adjustment period for them, and the traumas do not stop simply because there has been some stable pattern of living arrangement, secured for some of these kids and their families. It takes time, and we have to be aware of that. And then Linton also kind of talked about them as like pre-migration, migration, detention, and post-release, which I think are very similar concepts. But I think we just need to know that it's happening across the board. There's a immigrant children affirmative network program that I want to at least highlight, or the acronym is ICANN. And it's a team of lawyers, law students, psychologists, psychology grad students, trauma response professionals that really provide unaccompanied immigrant minors with know your rights training, individual legal assessment and court representation, culturally and linguistically appropriate services, a participation in positive youth development program that's specifically designed for these children. Their hope is to foster resiliency and hope in these unaccompanied minors. They also have these aspects to their program where they create a book of life to help them reclaim aspects of their identity, which I'll talk about in a minute. I saw 100% of you said that a retention of ethnic identity and roots is critical. They also have Toma el Paso, which is a board game through which they help them learn the legal system and obstacles they may encounter as undocumented, unaccompanied children. And they have cultural brokers, which are individuals who have a real deep understanding of the country, the culture of origin in which children have come, and the community and the culture in which they are entering in many ways. There's been research in looking at religious communities as being bridging and bonding institutions, and I think schools are really fundamental in being bridging and bonding institutions for these children, bridging the gap between where they have come and where they are entering, and helping them integrate and be connected to the context in which they find themselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma and the intersection of culture. I pulled this quote from this article that I thought was really powerful. It said, in 2017, Lorena, a 12-year-old girl, used the word tranquil to describe her Honduran neighborhood of approximately 3,000 families. No, she is not afraid to be out at day or night. No, it is not a violent place, she repeated. Her neighborhood, her home is tranquil. Lorena was asked what crimes she knew about in her neighborhood. She said there were murders around the football field. We asked how many last year. She replied 10 or so. We followed with, how many must occur for you to consider your neighborhood violent? And she responded 50. So I think this is also a good example of it's a form of resiliency and adaptational and functional coping skills in many ways. And so the barometer, the standard by which children are gauging and understanding what is unhealthy behavior or traumatic behavior really begins to shift out of a means of survival in many ways. So I think we have to be mindful of that when we talk to these kids and our kids and their families, that we may need to be careful and mindful about how we ask questions, what questions we ask, because our definition of what might be traumatic and violent may not look. There are no universal definitions, for better or worse, around trauma and violence in many ways, and that looks differently. And so I think we have to be mindful of that as well. So to become a trauma-informed system, we have to recognize that trauma is interpersonal and socio-political. The system needs to develop safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, and empowerment at all levels of service delivery. Trauma-informed school-based services should be aligned with the mission of social justice. Structural and environmental conditions must be considered and assessed in this process, and to adopt a trauma-informed care as an integral part of our school system is, I think, putting these children more at risk, and making our services incongruent and maybe ineffective in providing services to these children. There was legislation, federal legislation that was passed, that school systems are legally required to that children are, regardless of their status, immigration status, documentation, whether they're citizens, legal permanent residents, etc., are free school systems, free public education is afforded to them, and so to turn them away is, I think, problematic, and also legally something that school systems are not supposed to be doing. So a rigid and narrow conceptualization of trauma really fails to connect with the socio-political context. And so, I think we just have to be mindful of what that looks like for us. Traditional trauma theory imposes a one-size-fits-all perspective, which is incongruent with the experiences that these immigrant children and their families are experiencing. I like this notion. I like the idea of thinking about a postmodern feminism perspective, which provides us, a more expanded way of responding to the complexity of trauma. It's inclusive of intersectionality, gender, race, class, how people's socio-political position intersects and interacts with systems of power and oppression, to understand how they make sense of their lives in many ways. Burstow said that trauma is a reaction to a kind of wound. It's a reaction to profoundly injurious events and situations in the real world, and indeed to a world in which people are routinely wounded in many ways. And so the socio-political context and circumstances right now are traumatic and need to be implemented in our understanding and treatment and responses to these children and their families. Prilatinsky and colleagues have said, for a while now, that and others, that for wellness and healing to occur, it must occur at the personal, relational, and collective. We know that people get worse in isolation and get better in connection to others, and this is certainly true for Latinx immigrants and communities, if you will. So one does not compensate for the other. So just because you meet the personal, that does not mean somehow that the relational and collective is going to be satisfied. So our systems of intervention should incorporate all three of these aspects. And then, I want to spend just a few minutes on reconceptualizing resilience and resistance. I have more information here than I'm going to cover entirely, and so you have these slides available to you, and so please go back and look at some of this information as well. So resilience has been defined as the ability to return to one's original functioning after a traumatic event, and successful adaptation to challenging circumstances. The definitions fail to consider our connection to family and community, including the larger cultural belief systems in general. Not everyone sees it that way, but in general. So really I'm arguing for, and others have, to expand and connect the multiple systems in which our students are trying to negotiate, and the social context as an integral part of our process. So we can't understand resiliency apart from context. For adolescents, as an example, for adolescents, who maybe have voluntarily undertaken exposure to hazardous and violent conditions, such as those in their home countries, the act of this step may in fact itself be protective for them, right? And so I think we have to see it in that way and change how we understand it. Resilience is also not static. It's an evolving process where our strengths can be developed over time. And so I think those are important aspects for us to be aware of in this process. Resistance, I wouldn't be here if I didn't have people in my family resisting, or people in my community resisting in many ways. There was a recent ethnography of qualitative research conducted among refugee youth that found that the common sources of strength across these studies were social support, acculturation strategies, education, religion, avoidance, and hope. I think all critical aspects to helping these children develop a sense of resiliency. And so seeing the connection between individual and family problems and the larger socio-cultural context helps these families and these children recognize they're a part of a larger network of oppression, which in some ways maybe liberates them from feeling less burden of individual pathology. And we must see it that way. Those of us who are delivering the services, those of us who are educating these students must also see it that way, so that we also don't individually pathologize these students. So why the delivery of service matter? I know that people and immigrants are not utilizing services for fear of deportation. They don't want to enter in information into, their personal information for fear that someone's going to find this and that law enforcement may, come and track them down in some ways. All very legitimate fears, all very legitimate and valid concerns. And so many are isolating themselves at this moment in time. Those who are here in the United States already, and certainly those coming are really encountering what they think are, more traumatic circumstances. There's an isolation happening in many ways. And even there's been research that has demonstrated that even when individuals know of the services available to them, particularly unserved, underserved community members and immigrant community members in this particular case, even when our communities know that those services are available, they may still not use those services because there's a mismatch between what they're bringing into that and what they're looking for and what they're needing and what we're delivering at those moments in time. And so we need to combine services, make our services truly culturally and linguistically congruent with our particular communities. Pachansky and Thomas defined access to healthcare back in '81 as this degree of fit between who's looking for services and the systems in which they're encountering those services. And they talked about 5 dimensions: availability, accessibility, accommodation, affordability, and acceptability. And more recently, Swarman suggested adding awareness as a dimension. But we know that all those A's do not matter if the services are not in sync with the lived experiences and the realities of those who are seeking services. So school-based health centers provide care to traditional public, alternative, and public schools and private schools, and I want to talk about that. I want to give an example of a school-based program here in Oakland Unified School District. It's a high school, but they have a dedicated unaccompanied immigrant youth case manager, where they conduct monthly meetings with school, health, and community partners. It's overseen by a federally qualified health center that manages the school-based program, and has 8 school-based and school-linked health centers in the county, in Alameda County. The FQHC has developed medical legal partnerships with a nonprofit law center to provide no-cost assistance with housing, health insurance, employment, and immigration issues, which includes on-site meetings at community clinics and the school-based health centers with high legal needs. The law center they work with has expertise in immigration cases, and the providers meet, on a monthly basis. They also developed outreach strategies to bring the students in and their families in for initial screenings and a clinic orientation. and their outreach was very strategic because they knew that they needed to create an outreach a program and system that was going to be inviting, accessible, and welcoming to the individuals, to the unaccompanied immigrant. So they worked hard on creating a culturally congruent environment on campus where they had multilingual staff and multiple services available. So, we can't just open our doors without ensuring that when people walk into those to our spaces that their experiences are going to be validated in some form or another. We can't open the doors without changing our systems. Systems also need to change. The environmental context also need to adapt and change. And when you think about this concept of immigration, if handled appropriately and well, we all benefit. So changing our school systems in some ways to really adapt and accommodate to unaccompanied immigrant youth or newcomers, whoever it may be, really benefits all of us, even those children who are not directly connected to these experiences. And so this program also uses a strength-based psychosocial screening tool that asks about assets, supports, interest, etc. So it's not all what's wrong, but what's right as well. Students weren't asked about documentation status, nor were they asked in-depth questions about their migrant experiences, but they did ask about travel method and any stressful situations they may have encountered, just to assess for possible traumatic experiences. They also prioritized that those unaccompanied immigrant youth who were released have a court date, and so they asked which of those kids were detained, which ones were not, so they could identify their current need for legal representation, and that could be prioritized in this process. All their staff interviewed the youth in Spanish for those youth who spoke Spanish. What we're also seeing in many ways, and for those of you who work directly with these communities, you know that some kids are coming speaking indigenous languages in many ways, and so that's also has presented some challenges for some individuals who are trying to respond, but people are finding ways to do that. But I think that has certainly come up quite a bit. And then obviously, based on what they found in these initial assessments, they continue to follow up care based on what they found in those areas. And so the two primary areas of divergence between detained youth from those who were not detained at the border with or without parents was the urgent need for legal assistance and a lack of prior healthcare visits before screening. So, but the impact of trauma, PTSD, complex trauma, maybe some depression and anxiety, stress, all that was consistent regardless of their circumstances. And so I mentioned, the Supreme Court ruling in '82 that all children have a right for free public education. That's still a reality. So I want to quickly go through this. I just have a few more minutes left. I always run out of time in these short presentations, but I think it's important for us, as I mentioned, to find out what's right with folks, what's right with our kids. We know that teacher expectations have a lot to do with student success, and so I go back to my implicit bias slides, where I think if you're a provider of services, if you're a teacher to these students, etc., understanding what those biases are for you are critically important. There's been a lot of research actually that has demonstrated that even newly immigrated youth, in many ways, academically, if provided with the right support and services, are more academically oriented and connected, and even with some of their U.S.-born citizen peers who may be Latin or other communities of color. We also know there's been research that's been done with immigrants to the youth in particular, that they're also more civically engaged than their U.S.-born peers, and so there's a lot of resources that these children and their families are bringing with them to the United States that we need to use as resources to provide them with the best services possible, and to maximize their potential and capacities to transition and create different outcomes from here. There was some research done with the Video Advantage, which, this idea of living and being surrounded with people who kind of look like you, talk like you, eat the same food, that there are some, advantages to one's health. And so I think it behooves us to connect these kids and their families socially, contextually to others who can see themselves in many ways. We talked about this in the poll. Ethnic identity has definitely been connected to self-esteem, resiliency, thriving in many ways, and so it also behooves us now try to further colonize these children and their families, and really meet them where they're at, while also helping them adapt to the language here in the United States and some of the cultural that are different here in the U.S. versus maybe their countries of origin, but to deny them the capacity to reflect the values and the customs that are important to them is a disservice in many ways. And so I think that's something we need to be mindful of. Again, more research around connectedness and identity, which are have been shown to be barriers and buffers against depression. Maybe drug use in some studies, and other alcohol use, etc. I like this. The bottom bullet point talks about this idea, this threats to negative self-concept are buffered through individuals increasing their connection to ethnic group membership. So the National Latino Fatherhood and Family Institute has this concept of root straps, not bootstraps, and I think that's a concept we should incorporate. So creating a sanctuary-based, school-based context, some things to think about, safe zones, maybe providing a safe place for students to wait if a parent or sibling has been detained, welcoming places of learning, creating contexts that are consistent with the students that we're welcoming, free from racism, discrimination, and threats of deportation, informing and educating students and their families of their rights, ensuring safety in schools and homes, identify there's a local rapid response team in your community, holding immigration clinics in the community, partnering as the Oakland School District did with attorneys, immigrant justice groups, legal aid organizations, have a counselor available, for students and their families potentially, have someone who you can identify who can serve as the immigration resource coordinator and advocate potentially, have a list of resources, and really, I think, be proactive in protecting these kids and their families from further traumatization. And I'm not going to have time to show this video, but you can actually, I have a minute. I've got a couple minutes. Let me just try to show this here.
When you don't think of them as dummies, something amazing happens. The first luxury.
Okay, so first off, I don't have any investment in Acura, so just there's no benefit to me to having this commercial. But perspective, expectation matter, and how we respond and how we treat individuals matter. And so I think we need to kind of understand what that means for us as we attempt to respond to these children and their families. If you're in a school-based system, the expectations you have of academic achievement and how they will succeed or not succeed will definitely impact them. And there's been literature for decades talking about that. If we see them as our own, and go back to my story of no distinction. No, but aren't they all our children? Good things will come out of that, and the process can change. And so I think our expectations and our perspective and how we approach and how we see our work certainly matters. And then a final comment. Again, I've used this before, and I use it whenever I can. This concept of in la quecha lakin, I am you and you are me. You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. And so our capacity to see ourselves in those who we're attempting to serve and understand absolutely matters. And so I tried to provide a lot of, there is so much here to talk about. And I tried to get as much in as I could in a very short period of time, but hopefully it's provided some context and some things to think about today in my brief time with you. I also have a podcast where I've talked about these issues and a number of other issues. There's the link to the podcast. It's available on iTunes, Google Music, Spotify. My contact information is there. So, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gallardo. Thank you for your presentation and your sensibility. We have a few questions, so we're going to take a few minutes.
Okay.
For these questions. So our first question, many of these children will be negatively impacted by the separation and immigration process. Psychotherapeutic interventions will clearly be a part of their most immediate needs. However, should we be thinking and proposing policy changes that will translate into more human management of children that will prevent these occurrences?
Both. So I think we have to, as providers of psychological services, we have to do both, actually. So, if we go back to Prilatensky's conceptualization of wellness and healing, it's the personal, the relational, and the collective. And so to not do the advocacy and the trying to change the policies and procedures while also simultaneously serving the immediate psychological needs, we have to ask ourselves, how much are we really doing, and how much are we really impacting? If I'm trying to address just the psychological individual needs of the individual and returning them into contexts and situations and environments where the trauma is going to continue to exist, I have to question how much I'm really doing at that point in time. And so I think it's a both and we should be. Now, again, it's easier said than done, but I think even just planting seeds around how can you expand how you see your role and responsibility as a provider of services, as an educator of whatever kind it may be, at whatever level it may be, I think certainly is a fundamental necessity to creating different outcomes in these processes.
Thank you. Another question, how can schools without mental health services begin to create connections to better serve children who may be immigrants?
So I think, connecting your school to the larger network, environmental contextual network. And so, I would say look for providers and agencies that are local that you can build relationships with, you can collaborate with, because most of us who are working, and I would even go so far as to say all of us who are working towards trying to alleviate the distress and the trauma for these children and their families, are willing to do a lot and whatever we can to minimize and to create a different outcome, positive outcome for these children and their families. So don't hesitate to reach out to and connect with other providers, other agencies, other entities who you can begin to build relationships with. Even if it's just a small group or one or two people, start there, and you have to start somewhere. And then I think also, honestly, I think looking at budgetary and fiscal obligations and priorities. I think is also another systemic change that needs to happen in many ways. And so I think looking at, certainly finding folks who can provide low fee or pro bono services is always, I think, a possibility. But at the same time, I think a commitment to providing, truly meeting the needs of these children and their families is also reprioritizing funding and fiscal responsibility within our systems in many ways. So I think it behooves us to also think about those aspects as well. If it's a priority for us and it matters for us, then I think the approach needs to be multi-pronged. But certainly, I think fiscal and budgetary, considerations need to be, within that approach.
Thank you. So we ran out of time, but I appreciate you taking the time to do the presentation.
Thank you.
And for those of you who we didn't have time to address your questions, if you want to send them by email, maybe we can work through it that way. So thank you again, Dr. Gallardo.
Thank you.
This concludes today's webinar. I would like to thank today's presenter and remind our audience that if you're interested in receiving further training on this topic, you may email us. Please look at our website to learn about future webinars and other services we can provide. As you leave today, you will be directed to complete a brief survey about your experience. Your feedback is very important to us, and we appreciate you taking the time to tell us what you thought of today's webinar.